Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ICMDA webinars. This is number 272. So I'm Philippa Taylor, and I actually run a political leadership program, but I have a background in bioethics research and policy, and actually was a former colleague of Peter Saunders. And Dr. Saunders is traveling at the moment, so I'm stepping in for him. So it's my real pleasure to introduce Kallie speaking to us on egg freezing and embryo donation. So Kallie started her professional career as a scientist in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. She was utilizing a Master of Science degree in animal sciences with an emphasis on reproductive physiology and molecular biology from Purdue University. While assisting in the investigation of endometriosis and preterm birth, Kallie also pursued a degree in nursing, and she continues to work as a perinatal nurse. She has worked for the Center for Bioethics and Culture in America since 2018. First, she started as a volunteer writer. Then she became a staff research associate. And now she's the executive director. So thank you, Kallie, for coming to speak to us. Welcome, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you so much for having me. It is a pleasure to be here. I had the privilege of talking with you all some time ago about surrogacy. And now today I'm going to talk about a growing topic and kind of expand on what we talked about at the time on surrogacy. And today's presentation is going to focus on eggs, embryo, and the price of possibility, specifically egg freezing and embryo adoption, two industries, so to speak, that are growing, at least here in the United States, and I do believe abroad as well. And since I am a documentary filmmaker and I love to share stories, a lot of the work I do actually involves sharing stories of people who have been down the road of infertility or have experience with what I call the big fertility industry. I'm going to start with a little bit of a story to kind of wet our whistle and get our brains thinking. So when Emma turned 34 years old, her career was thriving, but her fertility doctor told her that time was running out. So she froze her eggs. It felt empowering. Science offering her a sense of control over her body, over her biology, control over timing to when to be a mother. 10 years later, the clinic still stores those frozen eggs, each one representing a decision deferred, a life imagined, but not realized. Meanwhile, another couple across town, unable to conceive, turns to embryo adoption. Now they raise a child who is biologically unrelated to them, but deeply loved. These are two modern stories of hope made possible by technology, but tangled in questions that we really need to think about. There are complex ethical, emotional, and even spiritual questions in both situations. What are we really freezing, adopting, and promising when technology meets a desire for life, a desire for control for life when we want it, when we're ready for it? So we're going to explore some of these questions today. And first, we're going to go through Emma's story, and we're going to talk about what is egg freezing. And here in the United States, this is a new fad. We call it stopping the biological clock, being able to put a pause on fertility. Like I said, in the United States, this is a new fad in fertility medicine. And this here on this slide, you can see these are just clips I've stolen from Google. When you search egg freezing and what comes up, the idea behind it. One of these from a popular business magazine, Bloomberg Business Week: freeze your eggs, freeze your career. This sense of having control, women being able to have it all, have the career that you want, go travel the world, find a perfect partner through dating, taking your time dating. You can secure your future by putting it on ice or freezing it. So what is egg freezing? Well, also known as oocyte cryopreservation, it is a medical procedure that retrieves eggs and stores those eggs for possible future use in IVF. And it's really important that we understand from the outset that IVF is required for those women to go back and use those eggs. So when she freezes her eggs, if she goes back, if she's one of the 10 to 16% of women who go back to use those frozen eggs, she will have to also undergo IVF to use those eggs. So this is quite a lot to think about for a woman. And there are important questions that she should be asking before even thinking about freezing her eggs. Questions like, what are my actual odds of success? How many cycles will I need? What are the health risks? Are there health risks? And are there alternatives? And so we're going to kind of go through these questions and maybe answer some of these questions through this presentation. So we're going to ask the first two first. What are the odds of success and how many cycles will she need? I like to call this the hope, the hype, and hard numbers. Egg freezing, as I said, is often marketed as a way to stop the biological clock, especially to career-focused women in their 20s and 30s. However, clinics rarely disclose how few women actually return to use those eggs and or how often the efforts fail when they do return to use them. And so let's go through that. Success in egg freezing is measured in live births. So having a baby at the end of the day. Success is not measured by how many eggs are frozen. It is not a guaranteed fertility plan. This is a medical intervention with very uncertain outcomes. An outcome, a personal outcome, the success of a live birth will depend on a myriad of personal factors. Probably the most important of those is the age at which the woman freezes her eggs. So age at freezing, the number of eggs retrieved. I spoke to a woman who, many women, but one in particular in the fertility industry, and she kept telling me and emphasizing how egg freezing is a numbers game. The more eggs frozen, the better likelihood of success. And we'll get into exactly how many eggs. But so the number of eggs retrieved and frozen, and then how many eggs survive that thawing process. The embryo quality of eggs once an egg and sperm are joined together. And then, of course, implantation success. So those are some of the personal outcomes that will determine success in a live birth. And here's just like kind of a quick and dirty chart that I created. It's really hard to actualize these numbers. Different studies are going to show different things. And at least here in the United States, the fertility industry promises more than, so you have to really kind of dig in the weeds to get some of these numbers. But as you can see from this chart, women under 35 are going to need less eggs than women older than 35 to kind of feel good about their success or their likelihood of success. So someone under 35 may only need 10 or 15 eggs, where someone over 40 is going to need more than 20, 25 to even feel good about the numbers of eggs she has stored. And then even still, the live birth rates, and I kind of did per 10 eggs, is still relatively low, regardless of age. But as you can see, as a woman ages, that number goes down. So younger women are going to need less eggs and have a higher chance of success. Older women, and this is at the time of freezing, are going to need more eggs and still have an even lower live birth rate. And this next slide here, I actually used AI to help me create this chart using some key sources. I think there are 4 or 5 sources, one from the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, to kind of show this again in a different way. So on the bottom here, you have the age of women at the time of freezing. And so you can just see if she's under 35 at the time of freezing, her probability of at least one live birth is much better than someone as they age. And the different bars here, the gold, the blue, and the green are different eggs. So at the gold, let's say she has 10 eggs, her estimated probability of one live birth somewhere between that 20 to 40% range. But if she has 20 eggs stored, that remarkably increases to maybe 60 to 80% for that one live birth. So just demonstrating here, younger women and more eggs. That's what's going to help with probabilities of success. So how many times will she have to go through this cycle to get 10, 15, 20 or more eggs? Let's explore that. The number of eggs retrieved per cycle also varies by personal factors. And again, being top of that list, age at freezing. Younger women who freeze their eggs are going to have more eggs retrieved per cycle. Also a factor, ovarian reserve, right? Her health, how many eggs she might have. And then, of course, the stimulation protocol used by the fertility clinic in question or that's helping her. And again, these are just average numbers, but you can see the trend is still there. Women under 35 are going to retrieve more eggs per cycle than older women. So someone under the age of 35 might be able to do one cycle and feel really good about her probability later in life of having one live birth. But like I said, and we'll get into this, the clinics are going to push for multiple cycles because it is a numbers game. And they want success, right? The fertility industry wants to show success. So more eggs, more likely to succeed. Women over 35 most likely are going to have 2, 3, 4, many cycles in order to really bank a good number of eggs for use later. And then this slide here, this chart helps us visualize what typically happens to eggs as they go from frozen, thawed, to fertilized, to embryos, and then hopefully a baby. And I just created this chart using a 36-year-old woman as an example. And so let's say that she has 100% of her eggs frozen. And for easy math, I like to use the number 10, but she likely will have more. So if she has 10 eggs frozen, and this slide, it says 75 to 95% survive the thaw, but that number is actually increasing based on new technologies and how good we've gotten at freezing and unfreezing eggs and embryos. So even if 95 to 100% survive the thaw, we could say all 10 would survive the thaw. Only 70 to 80% of those eggs are going to be successfully fertilized. From there, of those that are fertilized, only 50 to 60% are going to reach that critical blastocyst stage, which is a likelihood of becoming an embryo. Once the egg is fertilized and becomes an embryo, they're going to likely encourage the woman to do pre-implantation genetic testing, that is testing a biopsy of that embryo to make sure it's healthy and it's got the right number of chromosomes. They're going to do embryo grading. And so they might say, okay, from the blastocyst stage, we had 50 to 60% that were successfully fertilized. So now we're down to maybe 5 or 6 embryos. They might deem that 2 or 3 are a good quality for transfer. Because we know that having a pregnancy with multiple embryos and fetuses is an increased risk on the woman and child's health, we've kind of gotten away from crazy multiple embryo transfers. And now they're transferring 1 or 2 embryos at a time, maybe 3. But she might freeze those embryos that she didn't use, or freeze the embryos that aren't the best. And then from there, if they implant 1 or 2, those embryos have an implantation rate of 20 to 40%. So really, out of this 10 egg possibility, she has a chance of a live birth of 0 or 1. And this chart just really visualizes the attrition of eggs that she has available through this entire process. And the takeaway here is not that egg freezing guarantees a baby, but it shows, the numbers game, and the low, the attrition of eggs at each step here. And then, as I mentioned earlier, studies show that even still, the vast majority of frozen eggs are never even used. Only about 10 to 16% of women who froze their eggs earlier in life come back to use those eggs. But even if they still go back to use them, you can see how quickly they can kind of go through that resource. How much does this cost women? This slide, you probably should just ignore it, if I'm honest, because we're all in different parts of the world. And even as I speak here today in the United States, I think these numbers are going to change because our administration has just announced that the cost of IVF is to go down based on the cost of medications going down, and providing insurance for women who need to undergo IVF. What we don't know is if this benefit is going to extend to women who freeze their eggs, who aren't medically needing to do so. But as it stands, about a week ago when I started working on this slide and in my knowledge bank of how much these cost women, we can say in the United States that egg retrieval and freezing right now can cost anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000 a cycle. Then you add on the medication she needs, and then the storage fee, an annual storage fee. And then, of course, the future IVF that's going to be needed if she does go use those eggs. And as you recall from my hype, hope, and hard numbers, women are going to need 2 to 3 cycles at a minimum for a fair chance of success. So we're looking anywhere $30,000 plus range to be able to have a chance of 1 baby to freeze eggs for 1 baby down the road. Quite expensive. So there is a huge role in profit and marketing in this industry. The fertility clinic is a business with financial goals. It is an industry as a whole, is a multi-billion-dollar market around the globe. There are, these narratives, as I showed you earlier, these marketing narratives kind of frame it as this idea of empowerment, hope, control. But there are conflicts of interest and financial incentives that are shaping medical recommendations. For example, if you look at the corner, the left-hand corner of my slide here, this is an advertisement from California giving an egg freezing special for women who freeze their eggs with their friends. What other kind of medical procedure do we give a discount to when you do it with your friends? And then the next little image here is just showing the marketing of egg freezing parties to learn more and getting a discount for attending these parties. So conflicts of interest can really abound in this industry. If doctors at a clinic are benefiting financially from recommending additional egg freezing cycles, it can introduce a bias to medical recommendations. These marketing campaigns emphasize a decline of fertility as we age, which is a normal biological process, but they use that to promote egg freezing as a way to freeze time, which can encourage women younger and younger, we're seeing this age kind of be set back. Younger and younger women are freezing their eggs earlier than medically necessary or indicated, and leading to financial arrangements driven by a company's financial model. And then, as I said, there's a financial incentive for clinics to recommend more than one cycle. There are package plans, financing options, which kind of, all speak to this profit and marketing aspect. And I'd like to hide out here too, as egg freezing becomes more popular, and many women face the challenge of, well, how am I going to afford that? There's a new initiative, at least in the United States, by a company called Co-Fertility that offers women to freeze her eggs for free if she donates half of them to somebody else. This sounds very enticing, but as you recall, again, many women are going to need more than one cycle to feel good about, maybe I'll have one baby. So they're going to need more than one retrieval procedure. And this model here then sets women up for either multiple retrieval procedures, which are costly, because this particular model will only do the first cycle for free. It does not offer the same package for multiple cycles, so she can only do this once. So she will have to pay for it eventually. And it also increases her health risks, which I'll get into in my next slide. Multiple cycles increase your health risk. Or if she only does the one cycle for free, it's setting her up for failure. She's not going to have enough eggs to even remotely be close to likely having a live birth. It also captures women who are maybe altruistic by nature, thinking, oh, that sounds really great. I get what I want, and I get to help another family also have a child. It's capitalizing on that altruistic nature and her financial need, and completely downplays the role that she would be playing in the life of another individual, another child, because she is not just giving away her eggs, half of her eggs, she's giving away her genetic material that hopes to become a baby for someone else. So she is giving away, quite frankly, her son or daughter, her biological son or daughter. And there are wide-ranging implications for that. And we know we're starting to hear from folks who are donor conceived. And I won't go into that for this presentation, but we have to really think through these very slick marketing campaigns and these financial incentives that are influencing a woman's reproductive choice. I said I would talk about the health risks, so we'll do that now. The medical process required for egg retrieval is lengthy, and there are known medical risks associated with each step. If you recall, normal ovulation typically is 1, maybe 2 eggs being released from a woman's ovaries. Or ovary in the case of just 1 egg, which is a normal ovulation cycle. In egg freezing, though, the doctors want to have access to a lot of eggs, right? Numbers game. They want to bank as many eggs as they can during a single cycle. So they're going to do ovarian stimulation on this woman, which has hormonal side effects such as mood swings, headache, bloating, fatigue, ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, which has a range of side effects. It can be very mild or result in kidney, liver dysfunction and failure, blood clots, stroke, and even death. Her ovaries can flip and turn, causing a torsion because of the weight of them. Ovarian cysts can occur, and even cardiovascular events. During the retrieval procedure, of course, there are procedural risks, infection, bleeding, organ injury, and then risks from anesthesia as well. Of the medical complications that are known, they are not documented well, at least in the United States, in medical literature, because the individuals who are tasked with safety and oversight are also the ones who are profiting from egg donation and freezing. So that conflict of interest, you can see that here as well. Then, after the procedure, emotional distress can arise if frozen eggs don't result in a successful pregnancy, can lead to regret or a sense of failure. This also can lead to postponing childbearing because she has a false reassurance. She banks her age at 33 years old and then feels like she has all of the time in the world. So she delays and delays and delays. And so this can really set women up to postpone childbearing much longer than they would have had they not frozen those eggs. And then most concerning to date for me is that there are no major peer-reviewed medical research on the long-term effects of egg freezing or harvesting, and that includes egg donation, on the health of young women who freeze or sell their eggs, which really makes it impossible for women to give true, meaningful, informed consent. Without studying women who freeze their eggs over the course of their lifetime, we don't have any data on the risks of these women later for, let's say, developing cancer. And I do have women who have come to me who have frozen their eggs, who donated their eggs, and have found out that they have breast cancer later in life or other types of cancer. But the literature is not there. We're not tracking these women, which is very concerning. And then also, while we're on this idea of thinking of long term and her long term risks, while her egg quality is frozen in time, so to speak, right? She has 33-year-old frozen eggs. Complications for pregnancy at an older age increase. We know this, right? I'm a perinatal nurse. When someone comes into the hospital to deliver their baby, we flag them if they are an advanced maternal age or a geriatric pregnancy. We know that pregnancy complications increase the older a woman is, especially over 40. So even with healthy eggs, older maternal age increases a woman's risk for things like gestational diabetes, preeclampsia, miscarriage, etc. And then I can't give this presentation without talking about the health risks to children. Children born through assisted reproductive technologies do face higher medical risks. They're listed here. I won't read them all. These risks specifically on this slide are for for children who are born through IVF. So these are risks to children born through IVF, which if in egg freezing, she will have to use IVF later to use these eggs. So if she uses them, these children will have these risk factors here. So this is a lot on this slide. There are a myriad of concerns for egg freezing. First is just the general cultural normalization of technological reproduction. A while back, there was a 60 Minutes episode, I think just this year, that aired in the United States that said, a doctor in it said, sex is for fun and assisted reproductive technologies is the way we will have children in the future. And so we've just really normalized this idea that I'll freeze my eggs, I'll use IVF. This is all very normal and what I should do. There's an increasing pressure on women to have it all, to have the career, to be financially stable, travel the world, find the perfect partner, and then delay motherhood. And then, as I've talked about in this presentation already, the issues of conflict of interest in this multi-billion-dollar egg freezing industry, which is largely self-regulating, making it very difficult for women to give true informed consent, which is something the medical profession should be concerned about, especially when there's no long-term data on her health. Social media and marketing campaigns will target young women, encouraging them to postpone their biological clocks, yet they rarely mention potential health risks or the lack of long-term studies. Women who seek to freeze their eggs are often not counseled on the significant costs that it will entail storing them using IVF, and then also the unlikely rates of success or what to do with eggs that she doesn't want to use. There is no nationwide limit on the number of cycles a woman can undergo, and clinics, as I said, will typically encourage multiple rounds to increase chances of a future live birth. Yet most women who freeze them will never use them. And so, really, examining this industry further will reveal even more troubling profit motives. In fact, some of the eggs that are frozen and not used, or eggs deemed really low quality, will be used for research. Um, and this potentially creates a new market of potential abuse for this genetic material. And fertility clinics, just in all, continue to fall short in providing transparency about risks, outcomes, and the use of frozen eggs. And so this just highlights the challenges and the need, especially in egg freezing, for greater oversight, better patient education, and improved informed consent in an industry that is rapidly growing. And so from here, we'll transition to embryo adoption. And so egg freezing, if she doesn't use all of those eggs, it doesn't quite have the same moral weight or moral complexities as if, say, she got to the step where she fertilized those eggs and they now has extra embryos and she's frozen those embryos. Now we start to have a little bit of a moral weight with that. What do we do with those excess embryos that maybe she doesn't want or need? And so we're going to transition to that, and we'll do so with a story. In July of this year, Thaddeus Daniel Pierce was born from an embryo that was frozen for over 30 years. Finally brought to birth through embryo adoption. And he follows a line of extraordinary births. Molly Gibson was born in 2020 from a 27-year-old embryo, and her sister Emma was born from a nearly 25-year-old frozen embryo. All of them adopted, but the girls adopted by a different family than Thaddeus. This story shows the incredible potential of reproductive technology to adopt life long after conception, many years after conception. But they also raise some deep ethical and emotional questions about identity and consent and the responsibility of those who adopt and care for these children. Embryo adoption, no doubt, offers hope, but it also challenges us, I hope, to think carefully about the moral weight of life preserved and passed on decades later at times, especially in the case of these three little ones. All embryos available for adoption are almost always frozen first. So during an IVF cycle, even if it's not from a woman who froze her eggs, an egg is fertilized with sperm in the lab, and it's created either from a parent's own gametes or gamete donation. But usually, most of the time, multiple embryos are created, again, because this is a numbers game. The more embryos created, they can test them and find the perfect embryo and increase the chances of a successful pregnancy, or what they say will increase your chances. On average, here in the United States, an IVF cycle can produce 5 to 10 embryos, sometimes less, sometimes more, but on average, 5 to 10 embryos. And of course, they're not going to implant all 5 to 10 embryos right away. And these numbers, the 5 to 10, obviously vary, depend on age, egg quality, and clinical protocols used. But extra embryos that are not used are either discarded, destroyed. They can be frozen, cryopreserved for future use or for potential donation or adoption. And so we're focusing on adoption here. And right away, before we get into that, actually, we need to think about the ethics behind embryos being frozen in time. How long is too long? Who decides the fate of those unused embryos? And what happens if the parents who created them divorce or pass away before they're used? What is the emotional impact on both the child and adoptive parents if they're adopted later and brought to birth? What are the health risks to that child for being frozen for so long? And I would argue, I have it as a question, but I would argue that this is experimentation on really our most vulnerable form of life. And then just this idea again that embryos kind of have this bizarre fate as life, but also property because they're at the mercy of courts and contracts, etc. So these are just some questions before we even get into the adoption process. But how many embryos are there? In the United States alone, and this number is much larger around the globe, but in the United States alone, 1.6 million embryos, and this is a guesstimate because we don't track this, are on ice, are frozen. 6% of those right now estimated are available and up for adoption. And the adoption process is very similar to if you adopt a child that's been already born. There is a consultation, online inquiry, application, and screening. Some of the like Snowflake Adoptions, one of the organizations, have very specific screening requirements, ages of the intended parents, etc. You'll match with donors typically based on preferences, values, and legal agreements. You'll finalize with a legal contract. But then here is where it differs from adoption of a child who's already been born, in that those embryos have to be transferred or thawed first, then transferred to an intended mother. And so the adoptive mother, the intended mother, undergoes cycle preparation to prep her body and then undergoes embryo transfer. This is very similar to surrogacy. Of course, she's going to be giving birth and raising this child, so very different there, but she's still creating, or she's still carrying an genetically unrelated embryo and fetus. And so it's very similar to surrogacy. And then they will go on with pregnancy and parenthood. So very kind of similar steps to what we know about adoption. There are risks because the intended mother who carries the embryo or embryos that are not genetically related to her will face medical risks. These risks are similar to what we see in gestational surrogacy or IVF in pregnancies in older women. So research shows that when a woman carries an embryo that is not genetically her own, her medical risks increase compared to carrying her own pregnancy. And this higher risk is linked to several factors. One, the use of frozen, genetically unrelated embryos, the hormonal treatment that she has to go through, the hormonal risks of that cycle preparation to prepare her uterus, and the overall complexity of medically assisted pregnancy, so assisted reproductive technologies. So, and here we know in surrogate pregnancies that the pregnancy risks include placental abnormalities, preeclampsia, so high blood pressure, gestational hypertension, and the list goes on. And then there's also psychological and emotional grief as well that could factor in. And then also, as I spoke earlier, there are risks to the child. So these risks include the slide I included on IVF plus more. The evidence that children born from adoptive embryos do face higher risk for health outcomes compared to both naturally conceived children and compared to children who are born through fresh, non-frozen IVF embryos. And these risks stem from another combination of factors, the freezing and thawing process of their life, the medical and genetic history that we may or may not really know, the nature of IVF and surrogate pregnancies. And like I said, those risks are the same as IVF, but there's also this epigenetic and developmental uncertainty for those embryos that are frozen for 10, 15 plus years. They can carry epigenetic changes from the stress of being frozen, the lab culture environment, and then importantly, also the age of the eggs at the time of embryo creation. So we see that age again is really important. There are meta-analysis that show also an increase in birth defects from children born from frozen thawed embryos. And also, of course, the identity complexities that come with children born via embryo adoption. They may struggle with identity confusion and genealogical bewilderment. So definitely risks to both the intended mother and the child in embryo adoption that should be discussed at length. Success rates here, we'll just go through this. Data from 2004 to 2019, this is United States data. There were about 21,000 frozen donated embryo transfers in the United States, which resulted in about 8,500 live births. And then in a subset of time from that, from 2016 and 2019, there were about 8,700 transfers with known outcomes. And from there, 53% resulted in pregnancy and 43% in a live birth. So any woman or couple that goes into embryo adoption needs to be very aware that it is not always a success. There is high rates of miscarriage and loss and failure of implantation or establishment of pregnancy. So the success rates are not great. So when we think about embryo adoption, there are several ethical concerns to consider. The commodification of eggs, embryos, and parenthood. At the end of the day, there is still money exchanging hands here. The surplus of the embryos created, the moral weight of creating, storing, and discarding excess embryos. The idea that we should be balancing what's possible with moral responsibility. I was part of a talk yesterday, or listened to a talk yesterday, where they talked about how that moral reasoning and responsibility often comes after the technology is available, and how backwards that is. And here is one such scenario. And then also taking into weight quite seriously the identity and belonging issues of the loss of a genetic and familial lineage for that embryo, because that embryo is not just representing potential life into birth, but it has strong connections to a family history and to an identity. So what should we do? Well, one, in the United States, we need to stop generating excess embryos. We need to stop freezing those excess embryos, and we really need to be putting embryo adoption out of business, quite frankly. We also maintain at our organization that the general public has no moral obligation to rescue abandoned frozen embryos, just as we have no obligation to donate a kidney. We call these supererogatory acts. Those are acts that are good, but they are not morally required. We do believe that the parents who created these embryos have a moral obligation to reclaim those embryos. And that obligation just does not extend to or beyond the parents who brought them into being. And physicians have an obligation to think about this more clearly. Physicians who assisted in creating and freezing embryos have broken with the Hippocratic roots of medicine, inevitably harming embryos, those especially that do not survive the freezing and thawing process. So we need to consider what we owe frozen embryos as a society and as a profession, and then create clear legal frameworks for embryos that are already in storage and available for adoption. So we need radical transformation here. And then, of course, this is just for you, food for thought, deeper ethical analysis when we think about the 4 core principles of biomedical ethics and autonomy, the right of individuals to make informed decision. Are women who freeze their eggs informed? Are we really talking through these? Are we really giving a chance for them to have autonomy through informed consent? Justice. Most of these assisted reproductive technologies are available to those who can pay for them, to the wealthy. So we think about justice. Non-maleficence. Are we avoiding harm, particularly when we talk about the health risks to women and children? And then finally, beneficence. Are we acting in the best interest of all parties, including embryos and children created through these technologies? Technology expands what's possible, but ethics needs to remind us what is right, and we need to stop and think about that. When we think through those ethical challenges, there are simply questions we cannot ignore, and I leave you with these questions. Is fertility a human experience, or is it a commodity? Is it a commercial product? How do we protect women? How do we protect children? What responsibility do we have? And how do we retain dignity and identity? Just because science can do something doesn't mean that we must. If you or someone you know is considering egg freezing or embryo adoption, just encourage to ask questions, to seek truth, and remember that true empowerment is rooted in informed decisions. And with that, that is the end of my presentation. You can find more about my organization and follow me on Twitter, but that is my presentation.
Kallie, thank you so much. That was a real tour de force. Thank you so much for giving us all so much information. So I will run through one or two of the questions, but I'm going to have to be a bit selective, although I'm going to be slightly cheeky and actually just say one thing, because one of the things that struck me when you were talking, this is very real when we're discussing these issues, especially about embryo, egg freezing and donation, because in the UK we have probably a bit more regulation than in the States, but I had a good friend whose daughter was couldn't have her own kids, was offered IVF half price because she couldn't afford it, as long as she donated half of her eggs, which she did. So she got the half price treatment. But her mother, when she spoke to me, was incredibly upset because the awful thing had happened in that she hadn't been successful with her IVF, but she knew that the person who she donated the eggs for had been. So she didn't have her own child, but she knew someone else had her biological child. And it's just absolutely tragic. There was nothing that they could do about it. So it left her obviously with all the psychological consequences of that. And as you've hinted at, the effects on that child growing up as well, who will never know their her biological mother too. So these issues that you've raised are incredibly real. There's a lot of ethical and personal real stories behind this. Now, let me just run through a couple of the questions. Firstly, I had one right at the beginning saying, just a slightly more technical question, I guess. Given that you're reducing the egg total of a woman because of using IVF, does that then give them lower natural fertility after she's had IVF, basically reduce the egg total?
That's a really good question, and I get that question often. Right now, there's really no literature to confirm that. Reasonably, we can kind of think through that if you're banking a lot of eggs, that you might be reducing your own fertility. But more concerning is not really that you're using those eggs or that you're because we have a lot of eggs, and honestly, a lot of them just die through the natural process of life and biology. But more concerning would be the loss of fertility because of the hormones, because of the medications. That would be more of a concern than actual just losing that egg number and putting yourself into early menopause. More concerning is the protocol that a woman is put on, the high doses of medications, because women who are very fertile, so these women would be right in their 20s or 30s, very fertile, are going to respond to those protocols way better than a woman who's older and struggling to conceive. And so she's going to be actually at an increased risk for OHSS and other risks during that cycle preparation.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. I have another question here about embryo donation, which is actually one that I'd sort of had in the back of my mind. So I'll read this out. What about Christian adoption centers that rescue these frozen embryos and give an opportunity for those couples who struggle with infertility? And this person writes, I have a friend who went through this journey and now has a beautiful 7-year-old son. And actually, indeed, I know another couple who've similarly actually had twins and went to place in Europe where they were able to adopt children, and that's been very successful. And I suppose the question is, given where we are now, sorry, this is me slightly adding on to that question, is given where we are now and not where we'd like to have started from, do the benefits of embryo adoption and saving the life overweigh the concerns that you've helpfully outlined about how they came to be?
Yeah, Very important question. And the caveat to this one is there are so many personal stories, which makes this job so incredibly hard. And so I feel that. And two, yes, we shouldn't be here in the first place, which is why my comment on we should be working to put them out of business, meaning there should be less and less embryos available for adoption because we should be running out, right? We shouldn't be increasing the numbers of frozen embryos. Unfortunately, in the last decade, that number has gone from, less than 1 million to now almost 2 million frozen embryos, even with the advances of embryo adoption. So I wish that we weren't in that space. My point moving forward, if you're considering it, is just that a woman is aware of those risks. And I think that they're downplayed, maybe not on purpose, but I think that she needs to be aware. I think it's a wonderful way for us to bring these children to the world so they're not frozen inevitably or destroyed. But she needs to be aware of the risks to her own body. She needs to be aware of the risk that that child might not result in a pregnancy and a birth, and be emotionally, if you can. How can you be prepared emotionally for a loss that devastating, but prepared for that? Because as we see the success rates are low. It happens, obviously. There is hope, but prepare for that. And then also preparing to bring up a child that's going to have all of this kind of, for lack of better words, dumped on them, to know that they weren't selected from the first crop of embryos, to know that they will have siblings nearby, and to really prepare that child for these questions of identity that are going to arise later. So I certainly think it can be an option of hope and definitely consideration. My point is that we just go into it fully informed of all of the possibilities, so a woman can be informed about the risks she's taking and how to raise up this child.
Thank you. And that's definitely an onus for society and fertility industry. I would love to touch on the fertility industry. I've got another good question here. This is another difficult one. And yes, it is personal, but I think it raises an important question. So someone anonymous says, I have 3 beautiful grandchildren, all siblings genetically, born to my daughter who had ovaries removed because of low malignancy cancer very early in her marriage. Comments. And then actually there's a follow-up on that from someone else who says, I appreciate this question as there are medical situations that may warrant the use of this technology. So it's not always easy to be as black and white on the ethical considerations. So again, I guess comments really.
Absolutely. And, this did start as medical necessity, right? Patients who undergo treatment for cancer and will lose their fertility, lose their ovaries. It certainly started as that. But unfortunately, it has eroded into a money-making industry. And so I think that there are, that's definitely a point to consider about where it started and where we've gone now and where we've allowed it to go.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. I'm going to go back to the top question because this is unfair. I missed that. Well, I've gone to the second question. So a slightly longer one, but thank you for placing lots of ethical question marks around the fertility industry. A lot of these relate to the specific, very commercial situation and emotional blackmail narrative of US healthcare aimed at capturing desperate women couples, as you've outlined really helpfully. Can you personally imagine an effective and acceptable fertility service without these dubious marketing aspects? Is that possible? I guess they go on a little bit more, but
tricky question. I get asked this a lot, like even with surrogacy. Okay, take the money away from it. Take the money out of it. Take that out of it. You still have health risks that do not care about contracts. Health risks go beyond anything you can sign to say that you will act in a certain way or do a certain thing. Health risks don't care about the financial incentives or not. They are still there. So we are still putting young women and mothers at risk to their health. I know women who have died, young mothers, during these procedures. But health risks don't go away. And then we still have to think about the child and how they're impacted. And they're often disregarded a little bit in this conversation of having their views, their not only their health risks, but they are going to grow up into persons who question their conception, who question where they came from, who question So when we think about embryo donation or gamete donation, when we think of adopting children who are created and frozen for some time, we can take the financial and the marketing and the profiting out of it, but there are still some underlying concerns that need to be addressed. Specifically, the health concerns and the emotional state of and the health concerns of the child.
Yeah, which you've outlined helpfully in your talk. Thank you. I think probably got time for one more. This is another hard one. I mean, raises lots of hard questions, doesn't it? Especially when it touches people's lives. So this is someone who's anonymous and says, as an adoptive parent, I wouldn't want to make too much of not knowing your genetic parents. Parental love is much more important than the genetic link. So I guess that's partly a statement, but also a question and opportunity for you to just comment on that, really.
Yeah, I think that I'm going to have to disagree, or else do we see? I think the genetic link is important. Absolutely love from adoptive parents. I was a foster parent myself, so I understand that. But why we have agencies and companies like 23andMe and Ancestry and people who are adopted, and I've spoken a lot and at length to folks who are donor conceived, and they would probably also disagree that there is a desire to know your genetic history and your lineage, not just because it's interesting and you might actually have different traits than your adoptive parents and you want to know where those traits come from, but also from a medical standpoint, right? We screen egg donors and sperm donors at the time for health risks because we want to know a child's likelihood of maybe developing a certain condition later in life. And if they don't have access to that medical information, when you go to the doctor, they ask, give me the history of your mom and your dad and their grandparents or their parents, right? So your grandparents. And those are important questions. So I think I would have to disagree a little bit there that the genetic component can be very important.
Thank you. Thank you, Kallie. That's really helpful. Thank you for answering so many questions so succinctly and helpfully. I think we are going to have to draw it to a close at this point. So I will end by saying thank you very much to you. And thank you all for those who've come and listened. God bless you all and hope to see you again. Thank you.